Welcome back to Markets Today. In studio, we are joined by Mr. David Gitao, who is an investment analyst at Cytonn. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you.
This is a very great report that you have written. When we're looking at the macroeconomic outlook for Kenya, what are the key things that we're looking at?
Most of the key things that we were looking at were GDP growth, interest rates, our view on interest rates, investor sentiments, our view on currency, inflation, as well as security. Those are the key indicators.
So when you're looking at Kenya for the year 2020, are you excited? Are you neutral? Are you bearish about the economic outlook?
So our general outlook, based on the indicators that I've talked about, we were neutral. For GDP, we were neutral. For currency, also neutral. Negative on government borrowing.
Okay.
Neutral also on currency. Investor sentiments, we were positive, as well as security.
So how are you neutral on your macroeconomic outlooks, but then you're positive with regards to investor sentiment? What would be driving that sentiment?
So for investor sentiment,
yes.
It was mainly we were bullish in terms of the NSE.
Okay.
Mainly due to inflows coming in, mainly supported by the rally of the banking stocks that we are currently having right now, as well as stocks such as Safaricom. So that was mainly what drove our positive outlook on investor sentiments. Yes.
All right. So now let's go and look at the different items. Let's start off with debt. Earlier in the week, His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta came out and boldly says that he's going to raise infrastructure bond of 150 billion, which to me signifies or signals that he wants to actually extend the tenor of government borrowing. How are you looking at government borrowing in this year?
Government borrowing, this year we were negative as opposed to last year. Mainly is because of what we are looking at in terms of foreign debt as well as domestic debt. For foreign debt, we've heard that this year we are supposed to start repaying off the principal loans in terms of this SGR, which is projected at around 71 billion.
Okay.
Also in the budget, there was a budget. It was budgeted that in terms of foreign interest, it was around 139 billion. So in terms of foreign debt, we are negative.
All right.
Also in terms of the structure of the debt,
okay,
because we've seen that mostly right now we are having more of commercial debt, and that's why the CS of Treasury was talking about trying to restructure the debt into more cheaper debt.
Okay.
Also in terms of domestic borrowing, the government has a fiscal deficit of around 600 billion, of which 300 billion is expected to be raised in the domestic market. And with the repeal of the interest rate cap, we expect the government to have a lot of pressure in raising that debt, because now, as opposed to before, whereby bank models were mainly reliant on
extending credit to the government.
Right now they're restructuring their models, and they're the single largest holder of government debt.
All right. So when you're looking at the debt for this year, I know the budget process has just kick-started. It started off yesterday, and the process is now stakeholder engagement as you get to the process of having a policy statement. Do you have a sense of maybe the kind of debt levels you expect to see this year? Will it be similar to last year? In other words, would the government borrow about 300 billion or more than that from the local economy?
Okay, right now there's still some opacity, because remember, in as much as we are trying to believe that the government is working on the fiscal consolidation thing so that they can reduce the fiscal deficit, we are still adamant on the way forward, because recently we also saw that they raised the debt ceiling from 50% of GDP to 9 trillion. So there's still some opacity when it comes to debt going forward. Okay.
All right. Then when you're looking at the outlook with regards to GDP growth, what is your estimate for this year?
So our estimate, we had a range of 5.6 to 5.8 with a midpoint of now 5.7.
Okay.
That was our GDP estimate for this financial year.
What are the drivers for this estimate?
So mainly, the major driver of GDP that we are seeing this year is in terms of private sector credit growth. That was our key point. Since now the repeal of the interest rate cap, we expect now banks will be able to price risk relatively well. They can admit more riskier borrowers in terms of the SMEs, etc. Although it's the average is still as the same as the average of 5.7, the 5-year average. That's why we were neutral on that as opposed to the previous years.
All right. And when we go through some of the sentiments that have come from Honorable Ambassador C.S. Okoye-Yatani, he does say that he wants the medium-term growth rate to be 7%. Is that something from your models that you think is feasible in 2 or 3 years?
Based on what we've been having, I don't think 7.1 is feasible, because even if you look at most of the projections that have been coming from the government, both the CBK and Treasury, at the end of the financial year, they have been relatively off, because you'll find that, like this year, they have around 6.1%, of which I don't think it's achievable, given the fiscal space that the government currently has. So 7.2, I think it's relatively ambitious.
Okay, fair enough. So 5.7%, that's the average growth rate that you have for the economy. Are there any sectors that pop out for you? Is it where will you see the opportunities coming apart from lending to the private sector?
So in terms of GDP growth, we've been seeing most of the years, the largest contributor to GDP growth has always been agriculture in our economy right now. As well as now maybe the manufacturing sector, because we've always seen that trickle down effect. If the agricultural sector is performing relatively well, it also trickles down to manufacturing. And based on the Q4 rainfall that we saw, we expect spillovers coming into 2020, and so based on our expectations of now improved agricultural performance, it will also have a trickle-down effect on manufacturing, and that's the sectors that we are currently looking at. Those are the sectors.
Okay. Are you concerned about the rainfall, which is actually ongoing, the rains that are ongoing, and the issue of the locusts?
Actually, that's where I wanted to go next.
Okay.
That's the problem with now the dependency that we've been having on agriculture, because it's relatively erratic. Like last year, at the beginning of the year, we had a positive projection in terms of rainfall, etc. This year, so far, we've seen so far it has been relatively well in terms of rainfall, but the weather conditions have been erratic, because normally we don't experience such heavy rains in January. Also, now the other factors such as the locusts, the unforeseen factors in the agricultural sector. So it's a bit volatile.
It's a bit volatile. Are these two issues, these two risk factors, are they affecting the bread basket, the areas where we largely depend on getting our food from?
Okay. Currently, it hasn't really affected it.
Okay.
But if the government slacks, for sure, it will have an effect in the long run.
Okay, so those are risk factors to look out for. Yes. Which then would bring me to your inflation forecast, and for our graphics team, that is graph number 1. What are your expectations? What happened last year? What do you expect to happen this year?
So for inflation last year, we had an average of around 5.2% for the entire year. And also this year, according to our models, we also project around the same figure, 5.2. We don't expect a lot of inflationary pressure, especially on the key CPI basket, that is the food and non-alcoholic beverages index. Although there are some risk factors in the transport index, because there are some expectations of maybe an increase in terms of oil prices, which might also affect now the transport index. Okay. So that is mainly the key risk factor that we see in 2020.
All right. So so your inflation is more or less...
It's still the same, 5.2%.
Based on what happened last year. And what about exchange rate? What is your outlook on that? That's graph number 2 for our graphics team.
For the exchange rate this year, we have a range of 101 to 104. Okay. Although we expect it to be stable, although we have a bias of a depreciation of around 2.4% this year.
Oh, all right. Not 5%, so 5% is a bit of a stretch.
I know, we have 2.4%.
2.4. What was the depreciation last year?
Last year, it was an appreciation of 0.5%. The other year was around 1.3%. So I think...
so 2.4 is really in line.
We have a depreciation of 2.4%. Okay. Plus also looking at most of the factors that have been supporting the performance of the currency, we expect that depreciation.
All right. And what about... Now let's look at fiscal policy vis-a-vis monetary policy. What tools does the Central Bank of Kenya have in their arsenal to actually use this year when you're looking at interest rates, for example?
For interest rates, we've seen that from the November meeting that the MPC had, they cut the rates by 50 basis points. This year, in terms of monetary policy, we expect it to remain relatively stable for the first half, but we expect by the end of the year, maybe they could cut by at a maximum of 50 basis points by the end of the year. Although in terms of monetary policy, I think the government is a little bit in a fixed position right now, because in terms of the fiscal side, there isn't enough fiscal space in terms of the fiscal deficit, etc. So in as much as they would want to cut the rates in order to stimulate economic growth for private sector credit growth, there's still some conflict of interest because they also still have to raise government debt in the market.
So 3.5% deficit, that's just a dream.
That's just a dream. I don't think it's possible. So okay. I think...
So what can the CS do? Because on one end, he's come out outrightly and said, we need to cut back on expenditure. But then, as you said, his expenditure, he has to pay back loans, he has to pay wages, and then he has to give money to the counties. So what headroom, how can he be able to bring any savings, if any?
I think so far he has the right idea, because in terms of maybe there are some expenditures that they can't avoid right now. For example, the repayment of the debt. In that direction, we've already seen him talking about restructuring the debt, because we've seen that the debt structure, for example, the foreign debt structure has been readjusting if you compare in the previous years to now more commercial as opposed to multilateral and bilateral loans that usually we used to have. But he has talked about maybe restructuring to cheaper loans. If that was to be possible, maybe taking out the more expensive loan and replacing it with more cheaper loans, maybe it will make sense. Also, the fiscal consolidation, cutting off maybe the unnecessary expenditures.
What can he possibly cut off?
We've heard things about maybe the travel budgets, things such as those.
Do you think he would possibly go and look at the wage bill and maybe touch that? Because that really looks like the elephant in the room. That's the place that you must be able to go and say, reduce the head count.
When we talk about the wage bill, I think based on many governments that we've seen, also not Kenya alone, it's a sensitive
it's a sensitive issue.
Because it's also there's also that political angle.
Exactly.
If maybe you're running for office, you can't say that maybe I'll fire like half of my task force. They'll also have that political conflict. So I don't foresee any...
happening. So it's just the loan rescheduling that would potentially...
Maybe you can use that as a start point.
Okay. And then on the flip side, so we've talked about the expenditure for the government in the year 2020. Do you have an estimate, like a ballpark figure in terms of what number you expect to see coming from the budget statements?
This new budget statement?
Yes.
For the expenditure, I think in as much as we're talking about fiscal consolidation, we've been seeing an expansionary budget year in out. So even right now, I think maybe we can say around, let's say the same figure, around 1.7 trillion.
Okay. And then on revenue, because that's the other thing that you can potentially use to actually increase the taxes. Do you see an incidence of additional taxes, and are the current taxes going to actually be fruitful in terms of enhancing the revenue generation?
So in terms of taxes, this is a conversation that has always been there.
Yes. I
think there's so much you can tax an economy without affecting growth. There's some levels that you can't surpass. And right now, in as much as maybe you can try and come up with new tax measures, such as now those that we've been seeing, that an overtax aiming at raising around 25 billion, things such as those. I think trying to come up with new tax policies can be detrimental also to the economy. I think what they can maybe work on mainly is the efficiency in terms of collecting the taxes that are already there, and maybe now reducing on some of these negative influences that we've been having, maybe things such as corruption, etc. Okay.
So then they need to find a way to just stop the leakage from the revenues that
as well as also maybe improve on efficiency.
Do you see a situation where then we have additional taxes? Because for one, this budget must be balanced one way or the other. And it feels like the sales tax, the turnover tax, and the presumptive tax are just the beginning of a new list of additional taxes that could potentially hit the consumers. Okay,
I think if the policies that they are talking about right now, if maybe they were to materialize in terms of fiscal consolidation, reduction of maybe the debts, etc., wouldn't see this much pressure on the tax side, because why the KRA is being tasked with a lot of pressure in raising revenues is so that they can also match the expenditure. But if you were to maybe balance the expenditure side, you won't see the pressure.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about the fiscal, and then we've also talked about the interest rates. Maybe we can now look at the different sectors. I know you did say you expect to see some growth in manufacturing, maybe some slight improvement in agriculture. For manufacturing, is it a situation where companies are beginning now to increase their capacity, or where would you see the growth coming from this particular sector?
Okay, for manufacturing, like I mentioned, it's correlated with agriculture if you look at the previous years.
Okay.
So if there was to be an improvement in the agricultural sector, you'll see that. Also, most things in the manufacturing sector, such as agro-processing, etc., you will see some improvement in those sectors. Also, in the budget, you saw that there were some incentives to promote the manufacturing sector. So if you balance those two, I think we might see support.
Okay. All right. I think we can take a short break as we look out for the NSC closing bell. We will be back shortly.